the case of the Palestinian state, we know that the British government, together with Australia and Canada, they have recognized the state of Palestine. And many people are arguing the hypocrisy on the part of the British government. On one part, they're trying to help Israel militarily and in terms of the intelligence. The spy plane is just going over Gaza and gathering information, give it to the Israelis. On the other hand, they're pushing for a two-state solution. And Israel was not happy, by the way, with the new decision on the part of these governments. How do you see the situation with the state of Palestine? Do you think this recognition would somehow benefit the state of Palestine, or it's just somehow a political posture and doesn't mean that much for Palestine?
Well, it's a little bit like the glass, which is half empty or half full. It's certainly a positive step for let's say a Western country to recognize Israel, because so far you had about 150 states recognizing the state of Israel, but those who were in the West, United States and Europe, refused to recognize this state. So it's a good step forward to have UK, Canada, and Australia, and tomorrow probably France as well, recognizing the state of Israel. But we have to be very modest. I mean, we have to be very humble about this, because first of all, this recognition, which by the way has been already formalized in the UN, because the state of Israel is already recognized as a state by the United Nations. It has an observer status. It has not the full member status because of the Western countries refused that, but it's already recognized as a state. This is also something like the Holy Siege or the Vatican, which has been recognized as a state, officially a state, but it has observer status in the UN. The same as Switzerland up to 2002. Switzerland was an observer state, but the state of Switzerland was recognized. So today we'll have a very similar status for Palestine, which is already a step forward. But again, the problem is that there is absolutely no incentive in the West, because the rest of the world has probably not the political weight to do it. But in the West, you have no incentive to make something of this recognition. At the end of the day, we just recognize that the state of Palestine does exist, and period. This is not related to some kind of strategy to engage into a dialogue that would eventually lead to a solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And that's disturbing, in fact, because we see that all these countries, which, by the way, are all countries that have domestic issues, and that's very true with Keir Starmer in the UK and Emmanuel Macron in France. And obviously, this recognition is more related to the domestic situation in their country than to the improvement of the situation in Palestine. Because at the same time, as you rightly pointed out, with the spy flights done from Cyprus by the Royal Air Force, and other countries, by the way, who have also provide intelligence to Israelis, and the delivery of weapons. That includes France, UK, US, obviously. So meaning that on the one hand, we give a little something to the Palestinian, and on the other hand, we make everything to fuel the conflict and feed the conflict. So there is some kind of hypocrisy there. There is another aspect that disturbs me, because For instance, France, what Emmanuel Macron said, he's ready to recognize the state of Palestine, but there's a condition. This state must be disarmed. Hamas must be disarmed. The Palestine must be disarmed, have no army, and things like that. So, meaning that if recognizing the state of Palestine is one thing, making Palestine as a sovereign state is another. And there is absolutely no move from within the Western community to make Palestine a sovereign state. First of all, obviously, as we have mentioned that last year on your channel, by the way, you may remember that at the request of the UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, that was in July last year, if I'm not wrong, the International Court of Justice ruled that the occupation by Israel of the West, of the Palestinian territories, that applies to Gaza, but also to the West Bank, this occupation is illegal. And the International Court of Justice called all the UN member states to help Israel to vacate those areas and to let the Palestinians have their own settlement in those places. So far, as you probably noticed, there's absolutely not a single country that made any move to implement this resolution. After the decision of the ICG, there was a resolution by the UN General Assembly requesting Israel to remove all the settlements and all the settlers. They should return into Israel. But not a single Western country has even suggested it would help Israel in this. Meaning that we recognize Palestine, which is a mere political gesture, but we make nothing, but virtually nothing, zero, to have Palestinians or to make the Palestinians having their own sovereign country. And that should be the name of the game. And since the International Court of Justice has ruled that the so-called occupied Palestinian territory are Palestinians and not Israelis, and that the Israelis must go out of those territories, what else do we need? Obviously, we need to enforce this. And we have France, which is very keen to claim deploying troops for Ukraine and wherever, reinsurance forces and security guarantees and all that. But at the same time, it does strictly nothing to implement the mere existence of a sovereign state in Palestine. So there is something extremely disturbing there, that the West make just this gesture just to, in fact, just to calm their domestic public opinion, period. That's all. But they don't intend to do anything. They don't make any pressure on the government of Israel to implement the UN resolutions, and therefore nothing will really change for the Palestinians. In addition to that, if we look, this is related to the sovereignty of Palestine, because both the UK and the France, as I said, they made conditions for this state to exist, namely to disarm Hamas and things like this. And here there's also kind of a doctrinal issue there. The usual practice in modern times when we recognize states, first of all, we recognize states, not governments. And that's very important. I mean, when when we recognize a state, that means we know that a state of Palestine, France, Switzerland, whatever, exists, regardless of who is in charge in this state. The problem is that we have seen that already with Venezuela, for instance, during the previous mandate of Donald Trump. That and at that time, you remember, we have all this issue with Maduro, Juan Guaido, and all that. And the issue was that Western countries, UK, US, France, and others, stopped recognizing Venezuela as a state, but started to recognize Maduro as the government, the Maduro government. And therefore, they didn't want to recognize Maduro, and they wanted Juan Guaido. And when you start recognizing governments instead of states, that means that in fact you interfere with domestic politics. If you say, well, I will recognize France, but only if they have a socialist or whatever government, then you are trying to interfere with local politics. That's the reason why when you recognize, let's say, a country like France, you recognize the country, the state, period. And then you may have a leftist government, a right-wing government, whatever government. That is not the problem. You recognize the state, and then, depending on how elections decide, you may have a right-wing, left-wing, or whoever, and then it's up to your diplomacy to find the right line of communication, if you want, to dialogue with this country. But the recognition is not related to the government they have. So why do we do something like this for Palestine? When you say, well, recognize just if they disarm Hamas. Recognition of a state is not an award, it's not a reward. You see, recognition of a state is just to recognize a geopolitical fact, and then when the state exists, I mean, when you recognize this state and you recognize the other one, such as Israel. By the way, Israel, why do we recognize Israel? It has no defined territory, which is normally a condition to have a recognized state. So, because Israel has never defined its borders, so it has no defined territory, but we still recognize Israel as a state, even if it has Netanyahu as a head of government. So why don't we put a condition on the government? Because obviously it's not the normal practice. We recognize a state, and in Israel, by the way, it's a huge concession because Israel doesn't meet the condition to be recognized as a state because it has no borders. The Palestinians have borders, and they have defined them, and therefore you can argue that probably their government is not very stable, but they have one, even if we don't like it, but they have one. So the problem here is that when you start putting conditions on why and how you want to recognize a government or state, there is something biased in all that. And that shows that what the West gives with the right hand, it takes it away from the left hand, with the left hand. So this is a little bit insane. And I think the fundamental issue here is that de facto, we don't have normal relationships with Israel. And this is every single country on this planet which has a diplomatic relation with Israel has not normal relations. The reason being that Israel, if you do something they don't like, they will punish you. By the way, that's exactly what they said to France. If they recognize the state of Palestine, then there will be a punishment given by Israel. And this country is a country that used blackmail as a foreign policy tool. And that's the real issue with all that. At the end of the day, we tend to deal with Israel as we deal with a mafia boss, because people are afraid of what could happen if they don't do what Israel does. That applies to the US government as well. That's the reason why Trump strikes Iran, even if they didn't want to in the first place. And that's not how international relations should go. And just recently, you had Bezalel Smotrich, the famous or infamous minister of culture of finance, sorry, in the Israeli government, who said that Israel, because it's a chosen people, are above international law. Just said it. So how can you have normal relations with a country that declares it's above international law, who, by the way, demonstrably has never abidden by international law? The problem here is definitely the way Israel behave, and that's something that should be corrected. I mean, in some way, and probably the pressure that is building up in the Middle East, and probably one illustration of that is the recent mutual defense agreement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. That illustrates the fact that more and more in the Middle East, people are fed up with Israel. The problem is that because the West doesn't want to explain Israel, when I say explain, it's a euphemism, to force Israel to comply with international law. Failing to do that in the West, we are putting Israel in a situation where it will be probably attacked, destroyed, or whatever by the rest of the region. You see, because we fail to, let's say, not even condemn, but because we fail to tell Israel what's wrong, we create a situation where Israel is encouraged to do worse. And that's very true with the recent declaration by the Commission of the Human Rights Commission of the UN, saying that Israel commits genocide. Remember that when we talked about genocide, and when the ICJ was the International Court of Justice was seized by the government of South Africa in order to study if Israel was performing genocide,